One of the things that makes the reading of literature so fascinating, and I hope by this stage in the course you share that fascination, is that literature at the highest level is a hothouse in which individual genius can come into flower more brilliantly, more fully, and more early than in almost any other field of human creative activity, with the possible exception of mathematics, some of my colleagues tell me. In 1834, a young writer, aged just 23 years old, exploded on the literary scene in England. He wrote, in his initial volumes, under the pen name Boz. With that name, he'd published a few not very earth-shaking sketches for London papers before the book I'm talking about came out. If he'd used his real name, Boz, that is, Charles John Huffam Dickens, it would have meant less than nothing to the novel-reading public of the mid-1830s. Nicknames are always interesting. Boz was the infant Charlie's mispronunciation of Moses. He was nicknamed Moses in his family. What is interesting about Moses, of course, if you think of bulrushes, is that he was a motherless child, a foundling. The life dilemma which Dickens would return to again and again in his fiction, with David Copperfield, Pip in Great Expectations, and of course the little Moses we shall be particularly talking about in this lecture, Oliver Twist. Now, Dickens's own childhood was wretched. His father, John Dickens, was an improvident clerk. The family was constantly on the move, and traumatically, young Charles, aged 11 years old, was sent out to work for a few shillings a week in a bottle label blacking factory alongside the Thames. It was a shameful recollection that remained scorchingly with him for life, and which left him with a similarly lifelong sympathy for the abused and suffering child. Now, the novel with which Dickens, Boz, introduced himself to the great British public was The Pickwick Papers. It began life as a comic miscellany. Initially, as the publishers conceived it, the papers would be a series of comic episodes centred on a cartoon. It was mainly an illustrative work they had in mind. Young Charles Dickens was hired to do the copy text, the material underneath the illustration. And the comic Mr. Pickwick's Adventures, it was thought, it was expected and projected, would be serialised monthly for as long as the series could be kept going. Now, very quickly, the writer, young Charles Dickens, cuckooed his collaborator out of his front of stage position. The artist, Robert Seymour, went on to kill himself. The literary world can be very cruel. It may not have been directly because of the rivalry of Dickens, but that was certainly an element. Dickens thereafter, after the illustrator had departed from having the prominent position in the venture, Dickens took control of the project with a more docile illustrator, nicknamed Fizz, who partnered Boz. Fizz's real name was Hablo Brown. And Dickens went on to make, out of the monthly serial Pickwick Papers, what we would call a bestseller. By the standard of the time, Pickwick was an unprecedented bestseller. English literature had seen nothing like it before. And the Pickwick Papers remains. Remember, it's the product of a young man still in his early 20s. The Pickwick Papers remains one of the great comic novels in British literature. But it is, as Dickens himself felt at the time and felt more keenly later, light and episodic. It has no structure, just as it bounces from one comic situation to another. Now that Dickens had captured his public, his constituency, as politicians say, he had a mission, a sense of purpose. He was inspired in this mission by Thomas Carlyle, the great sage who saw England as a society fractured by urbanisation, fractured by the Industrial Revolution, and the universal heartlessness which those two great events brought with them. Dickens, still under 25 years of age, but with Pickwick Papers behind him and he was now in fact a famous writer, Dickens resolved to use the novel as an instrument of political and social reform. He would, to use Victorian terminology, write fiction with a purpose. And what precisely was that purpose? To make England a better England. Reform, in a word. Now, reform is a pregnant word in Victorian discourse. It's loaded with contemporary resonance. It was the Reform Acts of 1832 and 1867, which extended the franchise, voting rights that is, in Britain to full democratic proportions, practically, because women would not get the vote until 1917. It was a long time before they would be included in the electorate. But reform transformed England. Now, there were two ways that Dickens's personal grand reforming mission could be accomplished. The first was by throwing a bright light on current abuses, current hard-heartedness, that epidemic malaise of the time which Carlyle had diagnosed. And particularly the hard-heartedness which came down from above from the lawmakers in Parliament, the great ash pile, as Dickens would later call it in his novel Hard Times. He didn't believe in bureaucracy and bureaucracy's power to make a better world. Now the other way, one way, as I say, was shining this bright light, but the other way of bringing about reform was, as Dickens put it, to change hearts. Now, George Eliot, a novelist whom we'll be looking at quite soon, defined the novel as a tool for extending sympathy. Now, obviously fiction, which is kind of lying in a sense, is not going to put the world to right. I mean, it doesn't change very much of itself. But what the novel can do is to make us aware of the pain, the feelings, the needs, the fulfillments of others. It educates the sensibility. In the current literary world, this confidence that the Victorian novelists had in their literary form, that it was, as Thackeray put it, as powerful as the preacher's sermon, may seem naive. Modern novelists have a slightly different sense of what novels can do and what they can't do. But this confidence, this naive idealism, surges through and drives Dickens' fiction to its greatest achievements, and they are very great. He did reform things, he did change things, he did change his world. The unmatchable greatness of Boz, of Charles Dickens, the Victorians like to call him the great inimitable, was that he could actually penetrate through, he could actually sort of get through to people, and he could actually, as it were, change them, change his readers. His readers actually left his novels different people from what they'd been when they entered them. Now, Dickens set off on his world-changing, heart-changing mission with his second full-length novel, Oliver Twist, The Progress of a Parish Boy. Now, like its predecessor, Oliver Twist was serialised. It came out in bits and pieces. It was serialised in a magazine of which he was the newly appointed editor. His star was very high in the late 1830s, after Pickwick. Oliver Twist was also published, like Pickwick Papers, in monthly parts at $1, which is around 25 cents in American currency at the time, in 32-page instalments. It came out in different forms, and after a relatively short period, it came out in yet another form as a 3-volume novel. The Victorians liked to split their novels into 3 this way, in book form, so that the libraries, which dominated the supply of hardback fiction in the 19th century, could satisfy 3 customers at once. So one customer would have volume 1, another volume 2, and another volume 3. This, in fact, was rational, as they thought. Those who wanted to get to the story hot, as the Victorians put it, would buy the serial or the magazine. They wouldn't wait for it to appear in their local library. Now, it's important to note that with Oliver Twist, after the totally unpredicted triumph of Pickwick Papers, which just happened, no one knows why, Dickens began to plan and structure his narratives. Remember, he went into Pickwick Papers not quite knowing what was involved in it, but now, in fact, he had everything under his own hand. And this second novel, Oliver Twist, has a shape. It has suspense. It has a surprise ending. It has a plot. It has an architecture. Dickens, as his 35-year-long career unfolded, would become more and more preoccupied with plotting. But that process starts here with Oliver Twist, a well-made novel, He was aided in this new sense of structure by collaboration with the greatest illustrator of fiction in the 19th century, George Cruikshank. Now, in later life, Cruikshank would make the quite preposterous claim that he was the true author of Oliver Twist, and he may well have given the young novelist, who was many years younger than him and fresh to the novel writing business, some ideas, perhaps even the central idea. But the essence of everything Dickens wrote is just that, the writing of it, and he was the writer. Nonetheless, the collaboration of Boz and Cruikshank was an alliance, a very uneasy alliance of mighty equals. Let me demonstrate that. Everyone knows the most famous moment in Oliver Twist, the little workhouse boy asking for more. But when you call that scene to mind, do you see Cruikshank's etching, which had an aggressive artist's signature underneath it, or do you hear Dickens's description? Oliver, you'll recall in the novel, has drawn the short straw and has been deputed by his starving comrades in the workhouse dining room to ask for more gruel. What is gruel? Well, you really wouldn't want to know. This is the description that Dickens gives, that we hear. Oliver rose from the table and, advancing to the master, basin and spoon in hand, said, somewhat alarmed at his own temerity, "Please, sir, I want some more." The master was a fat, healthy man, but he turned very pale. He gazed in stupefied astonishment on the small rebel for some seconds, and then clung for support to the copper. The assistants were paralysed with wonder, the boys with fear. Dickens loves hyperbole, he likes, as it were, over-describing. And already, in fact, we're in a mixture of of actually sympathy for the starving boy and laughing at the buffoonery. "What?" said the master at length in a faint voice. "Please, sir," replied Oliver, I want some more." The master aimed a blow at Oliver's head with the ladle, pinioned him in his arm, and shrieked aloud for the beadle. The board were sitting in solemn conclave when Mr. Bumble rushed into the room in great excitement and, addressing the gentleman in the high chair, said, "Mr. Limbkins, I beg your pardon, sir. Oliver Twist has asked for more." There was a general start. Horror was depicted on every countenance. "For more?" said Mr. Limbkins. "Compose yourself, Bumble, and answer me distinctly. Do I understand that he asked for more after he'd eaten the supper allotted by the dietary?" "He did, sir," replied Bumble. "That boy will be hung," said the gentleman in the white waistcoat. "I know that boy will be hung." Now, Oliver Twist, like Robinson Crusoe or 1984, is one of those novels that everyone knows, even if they haven't read it. It's become part of our folklore, the everyday furniture of our cultural lives. But what is not generally known, I think, is the precise political context in which Dickens was writing, and which is crucial to the scene that I've just read out. Let me fill in some of that background. It really does help with the novel. The 1834 Poor Law Reform Amendment, long word for a very cruel piece of legislation, came into force a couple of years before Oliver Twist. It was a drastic revision of the old social welfare system. Until the 1830s, that system had been pretty well unchanged since Elizabethan times. The needy and the destitute went on the parish. They were supported by the community. But the parish system presumed a stable local population. You were born, you worked, you died in the same place. And if you were unemployed or if you fell on hard times, then in fact that was where you were looked after. But with the Industrial Revolution, the British population lost its roots. Everyone started moving around and migrating to towns, for instance. In Oliver Twist, the young hero is born, we know not where, nor until well into the narrative does he. He's brought up in a workhouse, that's an asylum for the pauperised, in Mudfog, which is as unlovely a place as the name Mudfog suggests. He runs away and has the adventures at the centre of the narrative in London, the Great Wen, and at the end of the novel he goes to live the remainder of his life in rural England. So where then does Oliver belong? Where's his parish? Oliver's restless moving from place to place is symbolic of the huge migratory shifts of population taking place in England in the first half of the 19th century. London alone was doubling in population every 10 years. Now, the old welfare system could not work with this mass upheaval. It was replaced by one which the governors of the country, lords of the great ash heap, were convinced could work. And this was what I mentioned earlier, the 1834 Amendment Act. It was based on the thinking of the philosopher Jeremy Bentham, the father of what was called utilitarianism. Now, the essence of Benthamism was that human beings organize their lives around the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. These are the great motives of our existence. It was, his political disciples thought, rational to apply the Benthamite calculus, as it was called, to the country's welfare crisis. Make the workhouse, unemployment, destitution, living on public charity, sufficiently painful, and human beings would choose the less painful, pleasurable by comparison, option of work and economic independence. You may remember in Dickens's famous Christmas story, Dickens, by the way, loved Christmas, the season of bountiful giving and kindness, when you didn't count the cost. You remember in A Christmas Carol that the as yet unregenerate Ebenezer Scrooge is visited by two gentlemen who hope to get a charitable donation from him. They do not know, alas, their man. Getting blood from a stone would be easier. Scrooge is Benthamite to the core. This is the encounter as it's recorded in A Christmas Carol. At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge, said the gentleman, taking up a pen, he wants a donation, it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute who suffer greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessaries. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comforts, sir. Are there no prisons? Asked Scrooge. Plenty of prisons, said the gentleman, laying down the pen again. And the union workhouses? Demanded Scrooge. Are they still in operation? They are. Still, returned the gentleman. I wish I could say they were not. The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigour, then? Said Scrooge. Both very busy, sir. Oh, I was afraid from what you said at first that something had occurred to stop them in their usual course, said Scrooge. I'm very glad to hear it. I wish to be left alone, said Scrooge. Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. He means the prisons and the workhouse. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there. Many can't go there, and many would rather die. If they would rather die, said Scrooge, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Now, Dickens saw this line of rational social policy for what it was, cruel and heartless. And he would use fiction to oppose it. He would change hard hearts to sympathetic hearts. As in A Christmas Carol, Scrooge's heart is softened by the narratives, little novels in effect, which the spirits of Christmas past, present and future show him. In Oliver Twist, Dickens made his arguments with a daring innovation. He made a child the hero of a novel. Now, that may not sound very daring to us. We, of course, are used to fiction which inhabits the child's universe and the child's perception of the world, but the Victorians weren't. You think of children in Shakespeare. They figure, if at all, as incidental victims, the princes in the Tower, for instance, in Richard III, Macduff's precocious little boy in Macbeth, or as they figure as the mischievous imps, the child who gives Falstaff cheek about his urine sample at the beginning of Henry IV, Part 2. There's no major work of fiction or drama or poetry which features the child as a central figure in Shakespeare. And with one great exception, if we look at literature generally, and I'm thinking of everything that precedes Dickens and Dickens' great innovation here, we can find one exception to this rule that the child is either excluded or on the edge or diminished in literature. And, of course, it's Wordsworth in The Prelude. But that poem, although it was largely composed half a century earlier, wasn't published until 1851, a decade and a half after Oliver Twist. It's a Victorian work, not a romantic work, essentially. Now, Dickens knew and loved Wordsworth's lyric of wise childhood, poems like We Are Seven and The Idiot Boy. The Idiot Boy and the Parish Boy are brothers under the skin. Wordsworth was an inspiration to Dickens, but the great innovation of Dickens, constructing a long narrative about a child's adventures and through the prism of a child's psychology, was Dickens's and Dickens's alone, and he deserves the credit for it. Now, let me somewhat modify that remark. It is not merely the child, but a suffering child, like the young Dickens himself, slaving in that Thameside factory alongside a workmate called Fagin, as it happens. Now, choosing the persecution of an innocent infant wherewith to attack the iniquities of the 1834 Poor Law Act was a stroke of genius. Now, the story of Oliver Twist is in many places pure melodrama. When we read it, we should remember that the Victorians, Dickens included, were never ashamed to weep. They loved melodrama, particularly melodramatic death scenes. Dickens, remember, is the novelist who created in the old curiosity shop the death of little Nell, a scene at which, as Oscar Wilde, living in the harder 1890s, said, one would need a heart of stone not to laugh at the death of little Nell. But the mid-Victorian heart was softer than Oscar Wilde's, and deaths were no laughing matter. Oliver Twist opens at a deathbed and ends at a graveside. As has been said, Oliver Twist, or The Progress of the Parish Boy, to remind ourselves of its full title, has a strong plot line. It's less sophisticated than that of Dickens's later, mature novels, but nonetheless it works very well. The novel opens powerfully. A vagrant woman comes, heavily pregnant, into a small rural town, Mudfog, recall, it's no beauty spot. She gives birth to her child in the workhouse and immediately dies. The nurse is drunk, the surgeon careless, the world is wholly indifferent to another mouth to feed. The death is moving and described in detail. The Victorians may have been afraid of the other kind of bedroom scenes, sex, but they never shrank from deathbeds. This is the description of the death of Oliver's mother. The patient shook her head and stretched out her hand towards the child. The surgeon deposited it in her arms. She imprinted her cold white lips passionately on its forehead, passed her hands over her face, gazed wildly round, shuddered, fell back, and died. Dickens had seen people die. They chafed her breast, hands and temples, but the blood had stopped forever. And with it, any prospect of discovering her identity or the identity of her child, who's assumed to be illegitimate and who's given the name Oliver Twist and consigned to be brought up in the workhouse under the discipline of the beadle Mr. Bumble, the man with the ladle in the earlier passage, and his ferocious wife. Oliver is a parish boy, a bastard and a foundling. Now the prospects for any progress, so to call it, in his life are not good. He will not, we apprehend, swell the surplus population, as Scrooge called it, for very long. Having reached boyhood, and failed to get the gruel ration enlarged, by the way, Oliver is farmed out as an apprentice to the local undertaker, having narrowly escaped the even less attractive career of chimney sweep. And the children were sent up chimneys to clean them. They often suffocated and were prone to horrific pulmonary diseases and cancers. He escapes that. He runs away to London, where he meets a street urchin, the artful Dodger, who introduces him to the thieves' kitchen run by the Jewish fence, receiver of stolen goods, that is, Fagin. Now, the depiction of Fagin's den is vivid. Dickens is a wonderful word painter, but to the modern sensibility, it's offensive in any number of ways. Let me read it to you. The walls and ceiling of the room were perfectly black with age and dirt. There was a deal table before the fire, upon which were a candle stuck in a ginger beer bottle, 2 or 3 pewter pots, a loaf and butter, and a plate. In a frying pan which was on the fire, and which was secured to the mantel-shelf by a string, some sausages were cooking, and standing over them, with a toasting fork in his hand, was a very old shrivelled Jew, whose villainous-looking and repulsive face was obscured by a quantity of matted red hair. He was dressed in a greasy flannel gown, with his throat bare, and seemed to be dividing his attention between the frying pan and the clothes horse, over which a great number of silk handkerchiefs were hanging. Now, why is it necessary to have Fagin fry pork sausages, as we apprehend? Is not the depiction of the man anti-Semitic? It's also diabolic, of course. The toasting fork reminds us of devils in hell. Well, it is anti-Semitic. There's no point in fudging this issue. Now, Dickens himself came to agree in later life, and he toned down the text of Oliver Twist. The sausages unhappily remain. But Fagin is central to the novel and irremovable. It's noticeable in recent film and TV adaptations, Ben Kingsley's in the 2004 Roman Polanski version of Oliver Twist, for example, that Fagin is changed into a figure who's much more sympathetic. Our hearts are not as hard as Dickens's were in this particular respect. The silk handkerchiefs, incidentally, which are hanging on the clothes horse, are stolen goods. As one of Fagin's juvenile gang, Oliver is subjected to a different kind of apprenticeship, pickpocketing on the London streets. Later, much against his will, he is used by the brutal robber Bill Sykes to assist in a violent home invasion, a burglary. During the break-in, Oliver is shot and incredibly is nursed back to health in the household he and Sykes set out to rob, and where he discovers that he is a blood relative. He has, as we gradually discover, been systematically criminalised by a vindictive half-brother, Monks, to keep him out of his inheritance. So he's not a parish boy at all, but an heir to a middle-class destiny. The plot from this point onwards unwinds somewhat ineffectively, but with some magnificent set-piece scenes, such as Fagin's last night in prison before he's being hanged. Oliver visits him, and now Oliver is a thoroughly gentrified and rather priggish little toff, and advises the old rogue to pray before going back to the comfortable mansion where he, Oliver, now lives. Fagin, meanwhile, swings at the end of his rope at dawn. Dickens's analysis of the British class system would, one is glad to say, become more subtle as his career advanced. He's still in his mid-20s, and he learned more about life, and I think truly one can say developed a much more acceptable view of the British class system as the years and his novels progressed. Making Oliver genetically upper class was facile, but it is melodrama, and complexity and the mastery of the complexities of life comes slowly in any literary career, even with a genius as precocious as Dickens is. As his career advanced in later life, Dickens became obsessed with public readings of his fiction. These readings earned him vast amounts of money, especially in America. But more importantly, they also filled a deep psychological need for him. The doctors actually warned him that he'd kill himself if he went on. His blood pressure went through the roof every time he gave them, and he did indeed die of apoplexy, of an exploding blood pressure problem, aged only 68 in 1870. He almost certainly shortened his life by the readings. But for Dickens, always his favourite and most exciting reading, exciting both for him and his audience, was The Murder of Nancy from Oliver Twist. This was his grand finale piece. Now, Nancy is the burglar Bill Sykes' fancy woman. Although a prostitute, she is good at heart. For Dickens, as he said, there is always a drop of pure water at the bottom of any weed-infested well. And her pure water is the fact that she's kind to Oliver, and she wants to do well by Oliver. And it's she, indeed, who betrays the secrets of Oliver's birth, and by snitching, she in fact makes herself a victim to Bill Sykes, who's furious that she's told Oliver's family who he is and where he is. And in retaliation, Sykes, who's been egged on by Fagin, batters her to death. The scene is the acme of brutality and high melodrama, but it was, I say, for Dickens, even though he'd written it at the very beginning of his career, it was probably the most powerful moment in all his fiction. Let me read it to you by way of my own climax. The housebreaker freed one arm and grasped his pistol. The certainty of immediate detection if he fired flashed across his mind, even in the midst of his fury. He decides not to shoot her. And he beat it twice, with all the force he could summon, upon the upturned face that almost touched his own. She staggered and fell, nearly blinded with the blood that rained down from a deep gash in her forehead, but raising herself with difficulty on her knees, drew from her bosom a white handkerchief, Rose Maylie's own. Rose Maylie is the respectable middle-class woman to whom she's, as it were, confided the details of Oliver's whereabouts. And holding it up in her folded hands, as high towards heaven as her feeble strength would allow, breathed one prayer for mercy to her Maker. It was a ghastly figure to look upon, the murderer staggering backwards to the wall and shutting out the sight with his hand, seized a heavy club and struck her down. Now, handkerchiefs figure centrally in this novel, and as I say, that which shrouds Nancy has been given to her by a pure woman, Rose Maylie, and it symbolises Nancy's own residual goodness. Dickens was very angry when his fellow novelist Thackeray suggested that London streetwalkers and prostitutes like Nancy were, in general, a lot less virtuous at heart than Dickens's creation. Dickens, in fact, had sentimentalised this essentially sort of rather wicked woman. Dickens insisted he had not. He believed in the intrinsic goodness of humanity. Now, We can stack up various limiting terms against Oliver Twist. I've used some of them in this lecture. It is sentimental. In places the plot creaks. There's a persistent surrender to melodrama. Oliver is far too genteel. A novel with the artful Dodger as hero might have been more interesting. But taking all that on board, it remains one of the great achievements of English literature and the gateway to Dickens's later immense achievements as the 19th century would have thought, and as I think we would agree, the very greatest novelist of that century.